So, in part one and part two of this series, I talked about how the gospel propels us to love strangers. And we're going to get into tactics in just a minute, but I wanted to spend some time talking about how the gospel does that. Because tactics will change. Tactics will be different for you 10 years from now as you try to talk to your neighbor than it will be for you when you try to talk to them tomorrow. Tactics will change, but the gospel stays the same. Similarly, tactics don't change hearts. Tactics don't save anyone, but the gospel does. So as we think about how to love others, we start first with the gospel, knowing that those truths will last for eternity. And then we think about, well, what tactics can we use to love people like Christ has loved us? Now, I said in the last video, and again I'll reiterate, my hope is that you won't leave thinking about how you can do one more thing or add one more thing to your list of 1,000 things to do. My hope is that unilaterally a gospel disposition towards the stranger changes everything you're already doing. That this is what it means to be a living sacrifice, like we read in Romans 12. That as we're spending time in our neighborhoods, as we are getting to know the people around us, that God would use that to reap a harvest. Jesus talks about how there is a plentiful harvest around us. And really, he only needs people to go out and reap the harvest that's already there. That's what God calls us into. And again, I'm hoping that we as leaders can encourage one another to be faithful to what God has called us to. Now, as we talk about tactics, my hope is that you will be living on mission in your neighborhood, in your workplace, and leading your community group to do the same, that they would be leading in their workplace, that they would be loving the neighbor next to them, either in their neighborhood or in their cubicle. And I hope that that's true for every believer in our church, whether they're leading a community group or not. I hope that we will stay faithful to Christ's call for us to love the stranger. Now, tactics. I think we really just have to stay watchful. All we do is we keep watch for gospel opportunities. Now, what do I mean by gospel opportunities? I mean opportunities for the gospel, opportunities to share the gospel in word and in deed. And I think it breaks out into those two categories. We have gospel truth and gospel work. That we share the gospel message, but we also work in our neighborhoods, in our workplace, how the gospel calls us to, that we would work to do the redemptive work that God has given us, wherever he has called us. Now, how do we start? I think first we start by preparing, and I think that starts with prayer. And one thing to consider is prayer walks through your neighborhood or whatever context you're trying to reach. That you would walk through your neighborhood or walk through your workplace and pray, asking God, how do you want to move? Who do you want me to see? Would you ask God for eyes to see, that you would be watchful? And that you would involve your community in that you would encourage them to be in it with you, that you would be in it with them, and that you would keep watch. And when God sends you an opportunity to dive in, to bring gospel truth, to do gospel work, that you would second act, that you would act on it, that you would jump in where God has called you to jump, that you would trust him with what he has given you to do. We talk about in CG Leader training gospel bridges, places where the gospel intersects with the rest of our life. The gospel has something to say about everything in our lives, and that when you find a bridge to the gospel with someone, that you cross it, that you go for it. Or when you see work to be done, that when you see a need, you fill it. When you see a need, you think, I'm sure that we could tackle that you figure out how to get your community group around that, to be in it together. Now, after you have prepared, you've prayed, you've kept watch, after you've acted, after you've jumped in, I think we dig in. We dig in both where God has called us in, wherever we have acted, wherever we've begun to engage, but we also hold fast to God, that we dig in with Him, that whether things go well, that He would keep us humble, and when things don't go well, that we would stay faithful to what He's called us to, even when it's difficult, that we would dig in with Him. And that we would continue to navigate challenges with our community group, that we would navigate this together and involve our community in the difficulties we might face. And that we would continue to stay faithful, that we would continue to be present, to be active where God has called us. Now, I realize that some of that's a little vague, and I can only be so specific because I have no idea the situations, the opportunities that God will call you into. But maybe I can share a story that might illustrate a little bit of how this can go down. My friend Brian is at a church out in Tacoma, Washington, and his community group had an opportunity show up, and they jumped in and saw God do amazing things. Now, a woman in his community group was looking around in their neighborhood where they met, and she saw the high school that was right down the street. So she went to the principal. She said, "Do you have any needs that we could help fill? I got a group of people over here who could jump in." And the principal said, "Well, the high school football team always has needs, so you could go talk to the coach." So she did. And she talked to the coach, and the coach said, "Well, we have some kids on the team who, when they leave practice or when they leave a game on Friday, they go home to a house that doesn't have any food. And it's hard to go home from practice hungry to a house that has no food." So the woman got her group around it, and they started making bags of food to give to these kids to take home with them. And she started getting people to bring pizza for the games. And they started being present on the field and in the locker room and in the stands. They were cheering for the team. They were going to their games. And as they were watching, they saw that these kids didn't have anybody on the sidelines encouraging them. Everybody was yelling at them to get back on the field, to get up, to go try, but nobody was in it with them. So they asked the coaches, and I don't know if this is legal at all, but they were on the sidelines praying for these kids at this public school, praying when they would get injured, praying for them as the game was difficult. The coach ended up asking Brian, my friend, "Hey, could you be the chaplain for our team?" Which, again, this Tacoma, Washington. This is the Pacific Northwest. This doesn't happen. But Brian said, "Sure, yeah." And they started doing Bible studies with the kids on the team. And in the end, 3 boys on that team came to know Christ because of this group's faithful presence. Because this group, when they saw an opportunity, they jumped. Now, as they stayed involved in the team, they ended up getting a little overcommitted. They ended up getting stretched thin, and they had to navigate those challenges with their group. They had to figure out, okay, well, how can we pull back? How can we involve the parents and the booster club? And they ended up talking with the parents of the team members and getting to know their families, all because of this need. And they continue to stay faithful to this team. They continue to serve there, and they're continuing to see God do amazing things through small acts of faithfulness. And you can see how they prepared, that they were praying that God would send something, that they were staying watchful and looking. And they went and asked questions. And when they saw an opportunity, they jumped. And as they saw opportunities come up again and again, they dove in and they were sharing the gospel truth and they were doing the gospel work. And they saw God do amazing things, and they had to navigate the challenges of getting over-involved and going through life change difficulties and different stages where people were getting married and getting pregnant and having to step back from those commitments. And they navigated that in the context of their community group. And they stayed faithful. And they saw God do amazing things. And I think that is what God is calling us to do. I don't know what your football team scenario is. I don't know what God will call you to. But I trust that if you pray, Make yourself available to God. Keep watch that when he presents you an opportunity and you act on it, that he will do amazing things in your life and in the lives of other people. And we have no idea who he will save to himself, who we will celebrate with for eternity, all because of one faithful response to God's work in our midst. Man, I think that God has so many opportunities in store for us to trust him all the more, to be his mouthpiece, to be his hands and feet on this earth. And I think we get so much of an opportunity to do that in our community groups. And you as a community group leader get such an opportunity to lead your people, to lead in being humble before the Lord, presenting ourselves as living sacrifices, ready to do what he's called us to. To close, I'd like to recommend a couple resources for you to keep on digging in on this topic. The first is a book by Rosaria Butterfield called The Gospel Comes with a House Key. This book is excellent. It's particularly good at talking about how do we love neighbors and love strangers in the context of our own homes. How do we see the kingdom come in our living room? And I think it's really interesting. Rosaria Butterfield lives in Durham, North Carolina. She's a local. She knows what it's like to do this here. And her family is a beautiful picture of what it looks like to be on mission, day in, day out in her neighborhood context. The second resource I'd recommend is a Community by Brad House, particularly the chapters Rhythms and Spaces, which we use in our CG Leader training. It talks about how do we weave these rhythms of engaging with others in our week-to-week life, and what are the spaces that we do this in community group, in our broader neighborhood or workplace context, in public spaces in the city at large. And these two books, I think, will help us as we continue to think through how exactly do we go about loving our neighbors as ourselves. And I would encourage you, as you consider how to do this yourself and how to lead your community group well, to remind you what I said earlier, that God does amazing things with very small things. That he uses the weak to shame the strong, that he can feed 5,000 with a young boy's lunch, that he can take what little we bring to the table, and he can do amazing things with it. I would encourage you to be watchful, to be prayerful, and when God brings you an opportunity, to act.